We're going to talk about the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. So here are your terms. Go ahead and write them down as always. Three systems of government competed for influence in post-war Europe. There was the crisis of democracy and the rise of communism. Now we're going to look at the third movement, which paralleled the others, and this is fascism. The emergence of fascist movements in more than 20 European countries after World War I was a sign that liberal society was in a state of decay, disorientation, and disillusion. These fascist movements differed, produced by what was going on in each country. The most famous of them were the Italian Fascist Party in Italy and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, in Germany. But there were many other parties, too, that had varying degrees of success throughout Europe. Now, these parties were pretty much everywhere across Europe, with the exception of the Soviet Union. The level of industrialization didn't matter. We see them in agrarian societies and in industrial societies. Fascist movements became regimes in only two countries, Italy and Germany. And a regime is where the movement is primary, so it is the government. So where does the word fascism come from? Well, if you look at this slide and hit the down button, you will see an Italian coin containing a fasces. The fasces is that bundle of sticks tied to an iron axe. And this used to be part of the Roman emperor's imperial regalia, so it was a symbol of his position. What do you have if you untie everything? You just have a bunch of sticks and an axe. The idea behind the fasces and fascism is individually we can be broken, but we are undefeatable when we stand together. So individually we are weak, but together we're strong. That's the main idea. There was no literary or philosophical inspiration for fascism, but there were some similarities in the movements that arose in the individual countries. So what were some of the common traits? Well, fascist parties rejected liberalism, democracy, socialism, communism, reason, and freedom. They were committed to aggressive nationalism, including war and conquest. They glorified a strong political party leader. They used myths, rituals, and other forms of the irrational to mobilize the masses. Lies and deceit were used to exploit the anxiety present in society. So what were some of the circumstances and conditions fostering the rise of fascism? One was a fear of communism among the middle and upper classes. Inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, people began calling for the creation of Soviet-style republics. Well, if you think about it, why would the middle and upper classes be worried? They're the ones who would lose everything when the state took over. Fascist movements, however, pledged to protect against communism and socialism. There's the disillusionment of many veterans of World War I and the mood of violence bred by World War I. You've got thousands of veterans facing poverty, unemployment, and worse. Fascism glorified war and gave them jobs. There's the inability of democratic governments to cope effectively with social, economic, or political problems. They discovered that total war produced total problems. And people began to lose confidence in the democratic governments, and they began to turn to fascist movements because these fascist leaders promised political order and other positive actions. There's extreme nationalism. Fascism represents the most dangerous form of extreme nationalism. Fascists saw themselves as dedicated idealists embroiled in a struggle to save their country from enemies, both domestic and foreign. We see this, for example, with Hitler focusing on the Jews. These leaders wanted to regain territories lost in World War I, and they wanted to conquer new territories. They glorified power, will, and instinct. Fascists argued that these were the true forces of life. And for fascists, force was a way to solve problems. In its worst form, fascism in Germany, or Nazism, was a bizarre racist mythology, preaching the superiority of the German people and the inferiority of others. So, those are the basic characteristics of fascism. Let's look at the individual countries involved. So we're going to talk about Benito Mussolini. Now, before World War I, he was a socialist and a journalist. In fact, he grew up in a family where he was just surrounded by the ideas of socialism. His father was a socialist. And he ends up serving in World War I, and this war transformed him into an extreme Italian nationalist. And Benito Mussolini is the one who, after the war, is going to organize and lead the fascist party in Italy. And it was a brand new party at the time. And when I say fascist party, I'm talking about a political party. This is a political party. Now, Mussolini took advantage of the situation after the war. He exploited all the post-war problems, things like labor unrest and the fear of communism. A lot of Italians believed that they did not get the territory they deserved from the Paris Peace Conference, so he used that as well. There was a lot of instability, and he used these instabilities to give him the chance to move, to rise in power. He spoke out against the government, the church, and middle-class culture. He gathered around him men who liked violence and elitism, and a lot of his followers were embittered ex-soldiers. There were certain segments of society that were very important to Mussolini, and so his followers included war veterans, landowners, big businesses, people who could help him, benefit him. He was an opportunist. In 1921, Mussolini founded a regular political party, the Fascist Party. His followers were called black shirts because of the uniform they wore, which consisted, well, of black shirts. And here you see some of his followers. By 1922, Italy was divided. You have labor unrest, you have massive unemployment, dissatisfaction among the citizens, the workers, and Mussolini saw this as an opportunity for himself. Like I said, he was an opportunist. So, in October of 1922, we have what's known as the March on Rome. Now, one of the things that was going on was that there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the government, as I said, and there was this massive outcry for the liberal prime minister to resign. So, October of 1922, we have the March on Rome, which really was an attempt on the part of Mussolini to threaten the government. The fascist followers of Mussolini, about 30,000 of them, marched on the city. Now, the king was a constitutional monarch, Victor Emmanuel, and when he heard that the fascists were marching on the city, he was terrified. He was afraid there was going to be a civil war, and he was willing to do what he felt he needed to do to prevent it. He really exaggerated the threat that Mussolini's followers posed. In an effort to appease Mussolini, he ended up appointing him prime minister. So the liberal prime minister, he's out, Mussolini's in. And the king thought that he could use Mussolini, or that Mussolini would helps heal these factions, bring the country together, prevent a civil war. The reality was that if the king had really taken a stand, that might have been the end of the situation. The king technically was the head of the military. So he's commanding the army, he's got parliament. If they had taken a firm stand, things might have been different. Because these fascist marchers, there were roughly about 30,000 of them, they were lightly armed. Some had no weapons whatsoever, some literally had pitchforks. But the fear of what might happen was too great. And so the king buckled and, as I said, appointed Mussolini. And I will say that Mussolini, when he became prime minister, became the youngest prime minister in Italy's history. And that's actually a record that he will hold up until 2014, when another man was appointed prime minister who was a little younger than Mussolini. And Mussolini was 39 years old at this time. Well, Mussolini basically bullied the king into appointing him to the position. So through intimidation, violence, and scare tactics, Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. In essence, he was a thug. He got power, he said, to restore order. I will say, though, he was very popular with the people. He told them what they wanted to hear, and he did follow through on some of his promises. In the next election, he won 63% of the popular vote. So as you can see, he was popular. And here you see the king at the time, Victor Emmanuel III, who, as I said, goes along with Mussolini because he wants to restore order to his country. For the first 3 years, from 1922 to 1925, Mussolini was ruling according to the Constitution, technically. By 1925, though, he felt strong enough to do away with the niceties of being prime minister. He took over the government completely. He became known as Il Duce, the leader. Lack of will on the part of the government allowed the fascists to take control. He felt comfortable enough in office to where he was able to ban all other political parties. And by 1928, he had made Italy a police state. So what were some of Mussolini's beliefs? He denounced Marxism. He felt Marx's ideas subjected humans to blind economic forces, depriving them of individual willpower. He said Marxism divided societies into warring classes, while fascism sought to unite them. He condemned liberal democracy and said that individual liberals should be secondary to the national community. He said Italy required power and unity instead of individual freedoms. This depended on violence and conflict. Violence was tied to aggressive nationalism and conquest. He wanted to build an empire. Mussolini succeeded in having a state ruled by one party that was under his personal authority. He coined the word totalitarianism, and I've mentioned this before with Lenin and Stalin. And again, totalitarianism is the idea where total power is monopolized by one party over all subjects and activities. It's a system where the government controls every aspect of people's lives. Mussolini also established a blueprint for other dictators to follow in their own rise to power. He even hired an American professor to come to Italy to write up a Bible of fascism, because it was basically a made-up ideology with no roots, so he decided that he would just invent his own. And here you see Mussolini and his ally, Adolf Hitler. I'm going to talk about Hitler in a moment, but initially, Hitler admired Mussolini and his views, and outwardly, Mussolini admired Hitler. Privately, Mussolini didn't really like the guy, disagreed with a lot of his beliefs. But they will be military allies as we move into World War II. So now we're going to move our focus to Germany and talk about Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. So here you see Germany after World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles. And as you know, Germany lost its empire, lost a lot of territory, and you can see by those shaded areas on this map some of the territories that Germany lost. So quite a substantial amount. After World War I, Germany had a new government imposed on it as a result of the Paris Peace Conference, and this was the Weimar Republic. So, as I mentioned when we talked about World War I, Germany lost its empire. It's no longer an empire. Now it's a republic. And this new republic is very weak. It faced a lot of political attacks from the extreme left and the extreme right. On the extreme right were army officers, aristocrats, big businesses and upper classes, all those opposed to the republic. They felt democracy was unable to defend Germany from the threat of socialism and communism. They favored an authoritarian government, and they blamed the republic for Germany's failure in the war, which, if you think about it, is very ironic since the republic wasn't created until after the war. But this group blamed the republic on the Versailles Treaty, which they felt they had had no choice to sign. And that's actually true. Germany was forced to sign this treaty. After World War I in Germany, you have a bunch of new political parties that emerged because, people were looking for something. They're looking for answers. And one of these parties was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It became known as the Nazi Party. And it was one of just many numerous conservative parties that probably would have vanished had it not gained a spectacular leader. A frustrated war veteran by the name of Adolf Hitler joined the party and began to organize it. So what do we know about Hitler? Well, he actually was not German. He was from Austria. And before the war, he was a hopeful young artist. Unfortunately for him, he was rejected by the Vienna Academy of Arts, not just once, but twice. So the war begins, and up to this point, he's been pretty much living on the streets. He's been trying to sell little pieces of art. He's been shoveling snow for wealthy people, shoveling their driveways. And the war breaks out, and he, like I said, has been living on the streets. Isn't real strong because of a lack of food, living out in the elements much of the time. And like many other Austrians, he goes to join up on this wave of patriotism. And he's rejected once again. He's told that he's too weak to hold a weapon. So he sneaks over the border to Germany, and they're like, yeah, we'll take you. So he joins the German army and serves during the war. And you can see in this photograph Hitler and some of his comrades. He is the one with the X over his head, sitting on the bottom left as you face the photo, with the large mustache, which was actually the style at that time. It was a Prussian-style mustache. But anyway, he served in the war, and he actually had a very important job. He was a runner between the lines, and that meant that he would carry messages, often running through the line of fire. And he would later be given an award, the Iron Cross, and he said that that was one of the most important moments of his life. Now, one interesting fact, like I mentioned, he has this Prussian mustache, which was the style. We're not used to seeing Hitler with that mustache. We're used to seeing the little mustache that looks kind of like a toothbrush. Well, there's a reason for that. Mustard gas came into use during World War I. And because of the prevalent mustard gas attacks, all soldiers were ordered to carry gas masks with them at all times. And evidently they fit very tightly over the face. So soldiers were ordered to shave their mustaches, and Hitler only shaved his enough to get the mask over. The result is the mustache we're used to. But whatever the case may be, he ends up surviving the war, as we know. After the war, he's out of work, down on his luck, moving around kind of like a tramp, and fostering a hatred for the bourgeois society that had rejected him. He admired the politics of anti-Semitism because, well, doesn't everyone need someone to blame for all their problems? He also recognized that he had a mesmerizing personality, and he used that charisma to speak to crowds. In the early 1920s, there were a lot of ex-soldiers, and they were, for the most part, very bitter. And they hung out in the beer halls, and they complained. And so Hitler uses that to his advantage, much like Mussolini in Italy. Hitler goes around building up the Nazi Party, gaining support, making promises to the people. In 1923, in an effort to gain power, the Nazis led a revolt in Munich, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Evidently, Hitler was inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, and so this was his attempt to do the same thing in Germany. Now, the way the Weimar Republic worked was very similar to the United States. They had had the head of the government, the president, but then there were various small German states, each with local government, much like the United States. You know, each of our states, like Florida, has its own governor and state government, but everything answers to the federal government. That's how the Weimar Republic was. And so evidently, members of the Bavarian government, that's the state in which Munich is located, members of the Bavarian government were meeting in this particular beer hall. And the goal of the Nazis was to hold them hostage, basically, while they made demands on the federal government. So, brilliant plan, but it was a total bomb. Didn't work. It was unsuccessful. And those who participated were arrested and sent to jail. And one of those was Adolf Hitler. So he goes to prison, and here you see a photograph of him in prison. I'm sure this is how he spent his days, you know, dressed up, looking out the window, gazing mournfully outside. But he put his time to good use. While he was in prison, he wrote his autobiography. It's called Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. And it offers the best statement of his views and beliefs. In it, Hitler set forth doctrines that justified aggression, terrorism, and the Nazi Party. It's called the Bible of Nazism. His beliefs were inspired by anti-Semitism, racism, social Darwinism, and aggressive nationalism. They were inspired by hate. His ideas and beliefs were counter to the Judeo-Christian heritage and the Enlightenment heritage. While he was in jail, he realized that the Nazis could not take power by force. Instead, he realized that if they were going to come to power, it needed to be legal. It needed to be democratic. So, he began to work to build the party's popularity. He tried to appeal to all elements of discontented Germany. So, he spends about 9 months in prison. He gets out, realized, as I said, that strong-arm tactics are not the way to go. So, he's looking for a legal way to gain power. He calls for a unification of all German-speaking people. And what this refers to is the idea that German-speaking people were scattered outside of Germany. You know, Germany lost territory after World War I. There's German-speaking people in those places. He wants all those people and places brought back together. He called for the expulsion of all foreigners from German soil, a renunciation of the Versailles Treaty, and he advocated nationalism based on race, with Germans being superior. And he made it very clear that German Jews were not considered citizens. So, what are the doctrines of Nazism? There is the idea of a racial myth that says that there were superior people and inferior people. Nazis believed that the superior, that's in quotes, Germans were in a war of survival. As the master race, they needed more territory, and so they called for a war of conquest against the Slavic-speaking countries to the east. That's talking about, or that's referring to like Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland. There's the idea that Nazis and Hitler felt the Jews were the most inferior of all people. Hitler blamed the Jews for everything he despised. Some of the things he attributed to them were liberalism and democracy, communism, pacifism, ethics. He felt that a Germany without Jews would be a Germany that was united. And to put things in perspective, only 1% of the German population was Jewish, and they were patriotic and loyal citizens. So that's the first doctrine, and one of the most important, of Nazism, the idea that the German people were superior. Another doctrine was the idea that the way to come to power was to manipulate the masses. Kill them with propaganda and they will react, was the idea. They used clear, simple ideas and images, constantly repeated, to evoke emotion. These images, this propaganda, emphasized Nazi willpower, strength, and instinct over freedom and reason. Had it not been for the Great Depression, Hitler might have remained in the background. But that's not the way it worked out. So here you see Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 20s as he is rising to power within the party and as they slowly become the most dominant party in Germany. Had it not been for the Great Depression, Hitler might have remained in the background. But there were a lot of problems, and Hitler and the Nazi Party exploited those problems. They exploited the anxiety that was present, and they offered solutions. Here you see one of their campaign posters offering work and bread. These are the two things that people needed desperately. They needed jobs, they needed food. The Nazis promised to provide that for the people. So what else did they do? They tore up the Treaty of Versailles and began building their own army once again. And remember, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from holding a standing army during peacetime. They promoted aggressive nationalism in order to build unity. And again, promised employment to the people. But nothing was said about the abolition of everyone's rights, or the one-party dictatorship, or the omnipotence of the police. Hitler relied on the private militia of the Nazi Party to literally beat up political rivals and intimidate others. They were really nothing more than street thugs. But by 1932, the Nazis were the single largest party in the Weimar Parliament. That meant that they dominated. And Hitler had been spending the preceding years trying to find a way to come into office in a legal manner. And he does it. So here you see Paul von Hindenburg. He was the president of the Weimar Republic, and he's the one who appointed Hitler chancellor in January of 1933. And again, it's thought that he probably did this hoping that Hitler could rein in or curb the brutality of the Nazis, who were little more than street thugs. So January 1933, he becomes the Prime Minister of Germany. Now, Hitler was probably appointed as a way to reduce Nazi street violence and to moderate their aggression, as well as to keep the communists at bay. Whatever the case may be, it got his foot in the door. Within a month of becoming Chancellor or Prime Minister, there's a giant fire at the Reichstag, or the Parliament building, and immediately the Nazis fan the flames, so to speak, by pointing the finger at the communists. They're like, oh, the communists did it. They set this fire. You can't trust them. Now, in the years following the Russian Revolution and the communist takeover, and then, we get to the 30s and Stalin's in control, there's huge fears all over Europe and the United States of the ideas of communism spreading. And as I already mentioned, especially during the Great Depression, these ideas were really appealing to a lot of people. Let the government come in and take over. So the Nazis come in and immediately, like I said, they point the finger at the communists, because what they want to do is make the people fear the communists. Here you see one of the reactions to the Reichstag fire. This fire was really important for Hitler and the Nazis. As I said, Hitler's blaming the communists. Now, the Nazis at this point don't have the majority vote within the Reichstag. Hitler wants to fix this. This fire and blaming the communists enabled him to do that, because it enables him to then go in and arrest the communist members of the parliament, thereby eliminating the Nazi rivals. So once the communists are out of the parliament, that leaves the Nazi party the majority, meaning they have the majority vote. Evidence was discovered after World War II proving that the communists really had nothing to do with this fire, that it was the Nazis who were behind it all along. Hitler's henchmen, his two right-hand men, Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering, were actually the ones who took care of this, who were responsible. And it's ironic, too, because the Parliament building is basically destroyed, and in doing that, it's destroying the visible symbol of democracy in Germany, because after this, we're going to see the Nazis pretty much taking over. In March of 1933, Hitler creates the Enabling Act. This was his legal way of coming to power. It's put forward to the Parliament. The Nazis are now the majority. They vote it into being. So what is the Enabling Act? Well, it's a piece of legislation that allows Hitler to create laws without consulting the government. So it's pretty brilliant, really, because it basically allows him, or enables him, to do whatever he wants without consulting anybody. So it allows him to dismantle the government legally and become a dictator legally. Under the Enabling Act, all political parties are banned except the Nazis. There was no more freedom of the press. The Nazi Party exerted control over every institution and organization. They eliminated all party rivals and critics. So, under the pretext of protecting the country from its enemies, in this case the communists, Hitler eliminated the rights of other politicians, all the opposition. Hitler becomes known as the Führer, the supreme leader and master of the German state, and then he began to establish his authority over all German society. Here you see Hitler with some of the top Nazi officials around 1933, and that man in the center looking at the camera is Joseph Goebbels, one of the men responsible for the Reichstag fire. He also will become the Minister of Propaganda, and he was one of Hitler's besties. They were best friends. Hitler even served as best man at Joseph Goebbels' wedding. Once in power, the Nazis begin to actually follow through on many of the promises they made. They began to create employment opportunities, jobs, such as what you see here in this photo, public works projects sponsored by the government, the Nazi Party, that got things done that needed to be done and provided jobs for people. It put people to work. And it worked really well. Here you see German unemployment starting at the beginning of the century through the early years of World War II. And especially, 1929 up till 1933, when the Nazis come to power, this is the Great Depression. Germany's really suffering, and you can see the massive unemployment, especially as we move into the early 30s. But then look how it begins to drop. Because one thing the Nazis did, as I said, they followed through. They provided jobs, and Germany began to recover. The Weimar Republic had been a federal arrangement with centers of power in each of the German states. Like I mentioned, they each had their own local government. Well, Hitler abolishes this. He felt it was too dangerous for him because he wanted all the power. So, in 1934, he unified the state with one center of government, and he declared the Nazi Party to be the only legal party. He believed that rearmament was necessary for Germany. It provided jobs, economic growth. So he starts that, he initiates that, and then he sets about creating a police state. The two most feared police units in Nazi Germany were the Gestapo and the SS. The SS were the elite corps, Hitler's bodyguards. These soldiers were personally loyal to Hitler. The Gestapo, another unit, personally loyal to Hitler. The Nazi Party begins to introduce terror and political violence as normal state policy. Life began to improve for the German citizens. One thing the Nazis wanted to do was to promote the benefits of National Socialism to the people. So organizations like the Strength Through Joy, that's the Americanized version of the German name, the Strength Through Joy were created to provide leisure activities for the German citizens. And this provided opportunities for the masses to participate in what would ordinarily be middle class outings, things like cruises or going away to camp, concerts, and so forth. And millions of people participated in this. It is state sponsored, and it allows workers to get away and to enjoy themselves for a weekend or a week's vacation. In fact, there was a cruise line that actually built several ships specifically for the purpose of allowing workers to have a state-sponsored vacation. Not bad. The Nazis created the Ministry of Propaganda, which was designed to, on the one hand, promote the Nazi Party, to promote Hitler, and on the other, to promote the superiority of the Germans, among other things. And so I just want to show you in these slides that follow some examples of German propaganda. Hitler is idealized in Germany. He becomes God to the German people, because after all, it's Hitler who's bringing them out of their slump, making them a great nation again. Here you see another example of propaganda. Hitler in his uniform, and you'll usually see dictators wearing military uniforms because it lends the idea of strength, but Hitler leading the Nazis and the German people forward to victory, waving the Nazi flag. You see the heavens shining down upon him, the eagle, and everyone following willingly. I mean, who wouldn't follow this guy? Here you see another example of propaganda, and you see that Hitler loves children. Now, this photo is designed to say several things. Yes, Hitler has a softer side. He loves children. They love him. He's not wearing his military uniform. Instead, he's wearing the traditional German dress, which softens his image. And superimposed on the photo is the Edelweiss, the traditional flower of Austria and Germany. Here you see an image from a Nazi Party rally, and they held these numerous times during the year. This image is from a propaganda film made by a German filmmaker, a woman named Leni Riefenstahl, and the film is called Triumph of the Will. Here you see an image from one of the Nuremberg rallies. Hitler wanted to link the Germans to their historic past, and the city of Nuremberg was a very important medieval city. And so that's one reason these rallies were held there. And so the Nazi headquarters, or their rally headquarters, was situated in Nuremberg. And they started holding these rallies in 1923 and continued up through 1939, the year World War II began. And initially, like back in the 20s, there'd be 20, 30, 40,000 people attending. But as we move into the 30s, especially after the Nazis are in full power, we see more than 500,000 people coming to these events. And they were just massive propaganda events, really, designed to promote the Germans as the superior race, designed to show the strength and unity of the German people. And here you see a close-up of Hitler speaking to the people. And again, his theme or his agenda was the superiority of the Germans, the inferiority of others. And, another thing that these rallies did was they promoted the idea of Hitler as a demigod to the German people. And the people ate it up. As I mentioned a few slides ago, the Nazis also began to introduce terror and political violence as normal state policy. As part of this, we see massive book burnings, and often it was the Nazi youth who participated in this, and you see that on this slide. Any books that were thought to promote radical ideas, that were thought to go against official Nazi policy, anything like that, burned. In fact, the Nazi Party, under the Ministry of Propaganda, actually got rid of a lot of books that would be considered classics. Of course, anything by Jewish authors would be destroyed, music as well by Jewish composers. But there were classic books that many of you may have read that the Nazis also rewrote and then destroyed the originals. Things like Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if any of you have ever read that. But one of the main characters in this classic is a black man who becomes friends with the main character. Well, the Nazis rewrote that because in Mein Kampf, Hitler rates the races of the world, with the Nazis, the Germans, being at the top, and other races are considered inferior, and so they didn't deem it possible for a white man to be friends with a black man, and so that book is destroyed. And other books as well that have been part of our society for generations, the Nazis either destroyed outright or rewrote. Also, as part of this effort, concentration camps were introduced. The first was Dachau, opened in 1933 outside Munich. And this is actually a little town called Dachau, and it's about 30 minutes outside of Munich. And initially, this is a work camp. We see socialists, labor union leaders, homosexuals, communists, and other persecuted groups and individuals being sent here. Anyone considered to be an enemy of the state was at risk of ending up in one of these camps. Dachau is the first. By 1945, there are thousands of these camps. The Nazi Party introduced systematic persecution against various groups which they referred to as social deviants and outcasts. The main focus was the Jews. So we see the systematic persecution of Jews beginning. Starting in 1933, not long after the Nazis come to power, we see Jewish businesses being boycotted. The following year, Jews were dismissed from their positions with the government. So, you might have a man who'd worked for 30, 40 years for the government. He was a loyal citizen, a good employee. He loses his job, and no Jews can hold positions within the government. Their property is also confiscated. And then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws are passed. These laws deprived German Jews of all citizen rights, and in doing that, they legalized racism. The Jews were becoming isolated within their own society. So we see Jews becoming isolated. Here you see a bench only for Aryans, very similar to what was going on in the American South before the Civil Rights Movement. Jews were separate. Under the Nuremberg laws, you were defined as being a Jew if you had one Jewish grandparent. So you have 4 grandparents. If only one of them is Jewish, you are categorized as Jewish. All Jews were stripped of their German citizenship. Jews could not marry non-Jews, and they were limited to Jewish names. And actually, all citizens, Jewish or not, had to choose a name from an approved list. It's just that the list of that the Jews had to go by was smaller, and they could not choose an Aryan name. These laws were meant to arouse terror and violence on a broader scale. And up to 1938, many Jews left Germany. Many others, though, just couldn't believe that their own government would treat them this way. And it all culminates in November of 1938 with the Kristallnacht, also known as the Night of Broken Glass. Beginning on one particular night in November, we see a violent outburst against Jews in Germany. Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked and destroyed. And then nearly 20,000 German Jews were rounded up and sent to the camps later that month. This was a prelude to World War II. Hitler saw the state as something like an organism. It needed to be on the move. It needed new challenges to face. And the German people pretty much believed that they had the right to take over. Hitler's main objective was to give Germany a powerful armed force and to get more living space, something called Lebensraum. In 1936, he introduced his 4-year plan aimed at making Germany self-sufficient. This 4-year plan called for the creation of a national highway system. So if you ever go to Germany and drive on the Autobahn, you can thank Adolf Hitler. Capitalists were encouraged to produce goods people could use. And here you see one of those products, the Volkswagen, the people's car. So if you have a Volkswagen, you can thank Adolf Hitler. He was encouraging these people to produce goods, like I said, that people could use and that were affordable. Also, public spectacles were put on, and colossal architecture was built as a reflection of the excellence of the Germans. During this time, as I mentioned before, we see a new kind of government take full shape, a totalitarian dictatorship. And this was a concept that was coined during this time. The 2 best examples, even though there were others, but the 2 best examples were Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. Some of the common features of a totalitarian dictatorship, just as a review, were a single, all-encompassing ideology that permeates everything and replaces religion as a belief system. A single political leader who is supposedly representing the general will of the people. It relied on advanced methods of control to impose its message of terror and violence. No limits are observed, and there is no constitution to save the citizens from the excesses of his government. The citizen becomes an object devoid of any rights. Nazism sought war, conquest, and racial supremacy. Stalinism sought a rationally planned socialist society through a state-controlled government. They will both have a huge impact on the world. So what we see is that by the mid-1930s, it was clear to everyone that Woodrow Wilson's dream of a world, quote, made safe for democracy, end quote, had turned into a nightmare. In country after country across Europe, democracy had been destroyed. Only in those places with solid democratic traditions, places like Britain, France, and the Scandinavian countries, did democracy remain strong. Where these traditions were lacking, elections and political parties quickly gave way to dictators and secret police. Remarkably, many of these new dictators were voted into power, and that's because of the Great Depression and the suffering of these countries economically. People were willing to sacrifice their freedom partly out of economic distress. During the Depression, a lot of people lost faith in the democratic government because the governments weren't fixing the problems. And the loss of freedom seemed a small price to pay for putting food on the table. Hitler, Mussolini, and other dictators offered simple answers to complicated questions. Trust the leader. Think only of the glory of the nation. Believe in the superiority of one's own race above all others. These dictators appealed to the crudest of human emotions, hatred and fear, and the state was everything. As Mussolini said, Fascism conceives of the state as an absolute, in comparison with which all individuals or groups are relative, only to be conceived of in their relation to the state. Blind loyalty to the state, that was what is important, and we shall see where it shall all lead.